Good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I'm excited to have the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Secretary James A. Baker. Secretary Baker has enjoyed a long and distinguished career during his lifetime. He has run 5 consecutive presidential campaigns for Presidents Ford, Reagan, and Bush. He was Chief of Staff to President Reagan and President Bush. He served as Undersecretary of Commerce for President Ford. He served as Secretary of the Treasury for President Reagan, during which time, and I know this is, you know, what an easy task it is to have a bipartisan Tax Reform Act of 1986. We'll see how quickly that goes this time. And from 1989 to 1992, he served as the 61st Secretary of State of the United States. During that time, he traveled to over 90 countries and dealt with the issues in the post-Cold War. He laid the foundation for the reunification of Germany. He assembled the coalition that ousted Iraq from Kuwait. He organized the Madrid Peace Conference, which was the first time that Israel sat down with all of its Arab neighbors. He's also a partner, a senior partner at Baker Botts. His great-grandfather was one of the founders of the firm. His grandfather was one of the modern architects of the modern Baker Botts, and was influential in so many ways in this city and, of course, this university. We've actually had, or have had, 5 generations of James A. Bakers at Baker Botts. Secretary's son, Jamie Baker, runs our Global Projects program worldwide. So it is a great delight to invite our partner and our friend, Secretary Baker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming today to this conference on global energy transformations. I am particularly proud that this event is the product of cooperation between the Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies and Baker Botts. What Andy didn't tell you was that we have a long-standing nepotism rule at Baker Botts. But we created an exception in 1983 that said if you have run 5 presidential campaigns, and if you've been Chief of Staff of the White House to 2 presidents, and been Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of State, there's an exception for you in the nepotism rule. So I was therefore able to join Baker Botts as the 5th James A. Baker to be there. Both of these institutions, Baker Botts and the Baker Institute, of course, are very close to my heart. And their record of partnership over the years is an impressive testament, I think, to the power of collaboration. Before I get to the substance of my remarks, I'd like to say a word about the development of our Center for Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute. Because next year, after all, marks the 25th anniversary of the founding of the Baker Institute, and energy research has been a very important, even decisive element of the Institute's success. When we were setting up the Institute, we were determined to focus first on areas where we thought we might have a potential comparative advantage. We needed, in other words, to develop high-profile programs where we could make our mark as a fledgling think tank. And given Houston's status as the energy capital of the world, energy was clearly one such area. But creating a first-rate energy program was a lot easier said than done. It required the full commitment of the Institute's founding director, Ed Derigian, and it has also demanded dynamic leadership of our energy program itself. We were very fortunate in both regards. From the very beginning, Ed has been a strong supporter of energy studies. He's provided strategic guidance, he's hired top-notch personnel, and just as importantly, he has helped raise the necessary funds. And the heads of the program, first Amy Jaffe and now Ken Medlock, have worked unstintingly to foster the energy program's reputation for first-rate, fact-driven, nonpartisan analysis. An initiative that began on a very modest budget and with limited staff has grown into one of the most respected energy programs around the globe, ranking now as the second most influential of all energy think tanks in the world, according to a study by the University of Pennsylvania. So Ken, you and the Center for Energy Studies have a lot to be proud of, and I want you to know how much we all appreciate your efforts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the subject of today's conference, Global Energy Transitions, possesses vast ramifications, of course, for the future of the United States and other global economies. Those transitions are visible everywhere you look. Technological change, notably in such areas as hydraulic fracking and renewable energy, is sweeping the energy sector, creating opportunities for producers and consumers alike. Rising demand for energy in China, India, and other newly industrialized countries is driving huge changes in global markets. And measures to increase the efficiency of generating, transmitting, and using electricity are shaping the behavior of utilities, industries, and households alike. The economic consequences of these transitions are really quite dramatic, but so potentially are the geopolitical ones. In particular, the astonishing growth in U.S. oil and gas production has reduced, though not eliminated totally, the international cloud of such traditional hydrocarbon producers as OPEC and Russia. At a minimum, the shift gives the United States greater strategic flexibility as we navigate the complex nexus of energy supply and global politics. Concerns over climate change have also transformed global energy markets. The displacement of coal by natural gas, the rapid growth of solar and wind power, and the increased use of electric or hybrid vehicles all reflect, at least in part, these concerns. Yet addressing the challenges represented by climate change remains highly politicized, at least it does here in the United States. Policies of both President Obama and now President Trump have proven divisive in this area, even perhaps incendiary. And it is on this subject that I would like to focus today, and specifically on the possibility of instituting a broad-based but rebatable carbon tax here in the United States. Now, I start by telling you I am anything but a climate scientist. I don't know anything about it. I don't pretend to understand anything about it. And I continue to have doubts about exactly what effect man-made emissions may be having on the climate. I do think one thing is unassailable, and that is that the future effects of climate change are marked by very grave uncertainty. As a result, it's my view that we ought to take prudent measures to limit the scale of any potential damage. I'm a hunter and a fisherman. I like clean air and clean water, and I don't want to see climate destroy my opportunity to get out there in the outdoors. These measures I'm talking about would represent an insurance policy, so to speak, against the risks that are associated with climate change. These measures, however, are going to have to take into account the importance of economic growth to human welfare, or they won't be politically sustainable. And of course, they have to be politically sustainable. Under our democratic system, politics is about gaining and exercising power. That's why parties exist. That's why we have campaigns. That's why we hold elections. But power cannot be an end in and of itself. It should be a means to implement policies that advance the freedom, the security, and the well-being of our citizens. And that's why earlier this year, I joined some of my fellow conservatives, including Secretary of State George Shultz, former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, and economists Greg Mankiw and Marty Feldstein, in proposing a blueprint for a rebatable carbon tax. If properly implemented, the plan would substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, it would also substantially eliminate sometimes onerous regulations that are a hallmark of our current energy policies. By combining these two elements, the plan represents a good faith effort, I think, to move beyond the rancorous debate that is surrounding today the issue of global climate change. And the need to find such a compromise solution is quite acute, because when we battle across partisan lines the way we have been doing, there's a great possibility that nothing at all will happen to remedy the risk. President Trump in June announced his intention to withdraw the country from the Paris Agreement and is rolling back the Clean Power Plan, keeping his campaign vow to undo the Obama administration's over-reliance on government regulations to reduce carbon emissions. He has done so amid a sharp partisan split in the country over climate policies. According to a recent Gallup poll, 84% of Democrats worry either a great deal or a fair amount about global warming. And about the same number of Democrats believe the problem is caused by man. In contrast, less than half that number of Republicans, about 40%, worry about global warming, and the same number believe that man is the cause of it. Now that Republicans hold all the levers of power in Washington, that is the House, the Senate, and the White House, I thought it was imperative that conservatives should come forward with a realistic climate change proposal. I want to talk a little bit about that today, but first I want to say that this hyper-partisan divide is really keeping us today, and has been for some time, from finding a way forward. So you got Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other. The plan that I have embraced and support, along with my fellow conservatives, the ones I mentioned and others, suggests a solution that rests on 4 pillars. These pillars are: first, creating a gradually increasing carbon tax; second, returning all of the tax proceeds of that tax to the American people in the form of dividends; third, establishing border carbon adjustments that protect American competitiveness and encourage other countries to follow suit; and fourth, rolling back government energy regulations once such a system is in place. The first pillar, a carbon tax, is the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. Unlike the current cumbersome regulatory approach, a levy on emissions would free companies to find the most efficient way to reduce their carbon footprint. A sensibly priced, gradually rising tax would send a powerful market signal to businesses that want certainty when they're planning for the future. By making the tax revenue neutral, as we propose to do, the plan would moreover sidestep ideological differences associated with the proper level of overall taxation. In other words, it wouldn't get all wrapped around the axle of the budget debate. A carbon dividend payment, which is the second pillar, would have all of the tax proceeds distributed to the American people on a quarterly basis. It's our idea that the Social Security Administration would handle the administrative aspects of that part of our proposal. This way, the revenue-neutral tax would benefit working families rather than boost government spending. It would not grow the government. I argue, therefore, it might even be properly conceived not to be a tax if it doesn't grow the government, if it's rebated to the American people. A $40 per ton carbon tax would provide a family of four with roughly $2,000 in carbon dividends in the first year, an amount that could grow over time as the carbon tax rate was increased. A carbon dividend policy could spur larger reductions in greenhouse gas emissions than all of President Obama's climate policies. At the same time, the plan would strengthen the economy, it would help working class Americans, it would reduce regulation, and it would shrink the size of government. The third pillar of the plan is a border adjustment for carbon content. When American companies export to countries without comparable carbon pricing systems, they would receive rebates on the carbon taxes that they've paid. Imports from such countries, meanwhile, would face fees on the carbon content of their products. Proceeds from such fees would also be returned to the American people through carbon dividends. Pioneering such a system would put America in the driver's seat of global climate policy. It would also promote American competitiveness by penalizing countries whose lack of carbon reduction policies would otherwise give them an unfair trade advantage. The plan's fourth and last pillar is the eventual elimination of regulations no longer necessary after the enactment of the carbon tax. Much of the Environmental Protection Agency's regulatory authority over carbon emissions could be eliminated, including an outright repeal of President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which the current administration, of course, is working to do anyway, without a carbon tax to replace it. The carbon tax we propose would help steer the United States toward a path of more durable economic growth by encouraging technological innovation and large-scale substitution of existing energy sources. It would also provide much-needed regulatory relief to American industries. Companies, especially those in the energy sector, would have the predictability that they now lack, removing one of the most serious impediments to capital investment. As a result, this plan has been endorsed by many companies that produce energy, such as Exxon, Shale, BP, and others. Perhaps most importantly, the plan speaks to the increasing frustration and economic insecurity experienced by many working-class Americans. The plan would elevate the fortunes of the nation's less advantaged, while at the same time strengthening the economy. A recent Treasury Department report suggests that carbon dividends would mean income gains for about 70% of Americans. You can see the potential effect of that politically if the message can be transmitted. Now, earlier in my remarks, ladies and gentlemen, I said that I didn't understand the science of climate change, and I don't, and I still don't. But at the risk of tooting my own horn, let me add that I do know a little bit about politics. Now, in my 88th year, it seems to me that this solution should be able to attract support from those on both sides of our political divide on this issue. Republicans, like myself, can endorse a plan that showcases the full power of enduring conservative convictions and embodies the principles of the free market. Yes, it's hard for many Republicans to impose new taxes, but you could argue, as I said before, that this is hardly a tax because it doesn't grow the government and it's rebated to the people who pay the additional cost required by the tax. It's a revenue-neutral approach, doesn't grow the government, and it doesn't crimp the national economy. Democrats, meanwhile, can finally get the clean, across-the-board carbon tax that they have said they wanted for a long time. They would, of course, have to agree to unwind regulations, which may be hard for some of them to do politically. But most economists believe that imposing a carbon tax is the most efficient way to reduce carbon emissions. And so endorsing such an emissions regime would accomplish their goal of protecting the environment. Of course, final legislation, should it come to fruition, and it's a big boulder to push up a high hill, and I understand that very well. And so the final legislation may fall below the ideal that I have outlined here today. If we continue, however, with the approach that we're now on, we may find ourselves 2 or 4 or 6 years from now rehashing the same political arguments that have poisoned our discussion of climate change in the past and still do today. Even the best of proposals, of course, have got to undergo the ugly sausage making that produces actual law. But we shouldn't let the perfect drive out the good. And above all, I don't think we ought to let our national debate on this issue wait until somehow the moment is right. Such a perfect moment may never arrive if we spend too much time debating the exact role that mankind may play in climate change and not enough time seeking solutions. If we continue with that approach, we may find ourselves, as I said, 2 or 4 or 6 years from now, rehashing the same political arguments that have poisoned our discussion of climate change in the past and are still poisoning it today. And so I would submit to you that the potentially tragic results of inaction are not worth the risk. This plan that my conservative colleagues and I have proposed, I think, can serve as an insurance policy, just in case the Al Gores of the world turn out to be right. Thank you all very, very much.
If you have some questions, you can give them here, and while we're waiting to see if there are any, we just have time for a few. Mr. Secretary, this plan came out, while we're waiting for questions from the audience, this plan came out about 6 months ago? Or
February, I think it was.
Okay. What will it take to get some serious congressional review of it?
As I said in my remarks, you know, let me answer that this way. Last week, within the last 10 days, I accepted an invitation from former Secretary of State John Kerry to go to Yale to speak at a climate change conference he was having up there. And my remarks were what I just said to you. Here's a plan that I think is really hard for people on both sides of the divide to criticize. What's wrong? I ask Democrats, what's wrong with a clean across-the-board carbon tax? And I ask Republicans, what's wrong with getting rid of regulations? And they don't seem to have an answer. At Yale, all they want to talk about was the cataclysmic effects of continuing on in this course, and that climate change was going to be the end of Western civilization as we know it. Well, you know, it may be. I don't know. I don't understand the climate debate. But you don't need to get there. This proposal gives you a way that both sides ought to be able to accept, where you never have to answer, where you never have to resolve the question of who's right about man's contribution to global warming. Why not go that route? Now, as I say, it's a big boulder to push up a hill, just like anything's a big boulder today in Washington, as we're learning. But it's a damn good plan, and over time, I think, as people begin to understand it And as the demagogues who want to say, it's just another tax, we're against taxes, or the demagogues on the other side who say, how in the world can you get rid of these regulations? Health and safety require that we keep them. So that's the only way I know to answer your question. It's a big push, but sooner or later, we're going to have to come to something like this if we're going to get anything done on this issue.
Thank you. One question from the audience is, what becomes of the state-level environmental regulations in this great bargain?
Well, that's going to be up to the voters in those states. And if a state seeks to, even after getting a clean, broad-based carbon tax to reduce emissions, which is the most effective way, according to economists, the most effective way to get it done. If you still have states like the People's Republic of California who want to still put regulations out there, I think sooner or later the voters are going to have something to say about that.
Have you seen any difference in support from super majors or other major energy companies domestically and foreign on this? Is there a difference between foreign and domestic support?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think, of course, this is a problem for the most part that applies here in the United States. At least it's a more substantial problem here than it is in some other countries. But there are foreign companies that have signed on to this, like Total. Our biggest retailer, Walmart has signed on to it, including the major energy producers that I mentioned.
Okay. Thank you very much, Secretary Baker.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Turn this over to Steve Miles.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your time this afternoon and for your thoughtful remarks and perspective, as always. You've added a great deal to the summit, and we're indebted to you for your participation today, for your contribution to both Baker Botts and to the Baker Institute, and of course, for your service to our country. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now moving to the third panel of the afternoon of the day, which is our global gas market panel, and I would call Molly Duckworth, my partner and moderator, up to the stage, and along with the other panelists. And I'll just say this is home base for me. I'm somebody who really enjoys gas and LNG markets, so I'm excited about this panel and looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Thank you.
I'm going to start over here so that I can actually be able to look my panelists in the eye. When I saw kind of how this conference was getting set up and that we were going to be following Secretary Baker, I thought, we're in the unenviable position of trying to follow such a great speaker who always has really interesting ideas. But I think that's what's great about this conference and talking about the global energy transitions is that, as we've seen this morning, we're not afraid to, get some really interesting issues out on the table and talk about ideas and kind of see what's going on in the energy market across the world. And so we're really excited to bring the perspective of the global gas industry to you as well this afternoon. So we have a great panel put together, so I'll do just some very brief introductions, and then they'll each have a chance to give their opening remarks. So coming down the line, we have Tony Chovanec, who's the Senior Vice President at Enterprise Products Partners, one of the largest integrated midstream energy companies in North America, where he heads the fundamentals team and is focused on evaluating supply and demand fundamentals. And he's going to, talk with us a little bit about his views on how he sees that in the gas industry. Next to Tony, we have Meg Gentle. She's the president and CEO of Tellurian, which is focused on developing low-cost natural gas-related infrastructure and delivering natural gas to customers worldwide, and is developing an LNG terminal facility and associated pipeline in Southwest Louisiana that I'm sure you'll hear about from Meg. Prior to joining Tellurian, Meg was the executive vice president of marketing at Cheniere Energy as well. Next to Meg is Roberto Simon. He's the managing director at Société Générale, or SocGen, as most of us Americans like to fondly refer to it. He's the head of the bank's Natural Resources and Infrastructure for the Americas division. Roberto has been involved in a number of very important project financings throughout the gas industry, and so he's going to bring a perspective of the capital providers as we discuss transitions in the gas industry. And then last but certainly not least, we have Christopher Smith, who is the Baker Institute Advisory Board Fellow in Energy Studies. Chris served as the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy under the Obama administration. And he focused his work at the Institute in areas such as energy poverty, energy resource development in developing nations, as well as energy transitions, the topic of our conference today, and the role of policy in addressing shifts in energy patterns. So I think we have the makings of a really interesting discussion about how the gas industry, what the current state is of our energy transition. So we'll start out with a kind of macro view from Tony.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting Enterprise to participate today. We really appreciate that opportunity. See if I can get this to turn here. Nope. There we go. Enterprise Products, so who are we? We're one of the largest midstreams in the United States. When I say large, both in the size, we're about an $80 billion enterprise company. We're involved in natural gas, providing natural gas liquids, refined products, petrochemicals, services. So midstream, everything that happens between upstream, being the producer, and downstream, think of that as being a refiner. Not exactly always a clean line, but that's the business we're in. My comments today are going to touch on U.S. supply and demand and the fundamentals across these. And I'm a data-driven kind of person. So we're going to talk about data today for crude oil, natural gas liquids. On some of the slides I'm going to show you, I want you to think about them as being pictures, okay? We're not going to get into the details. I'm going to tell you what the picture says as I see the pictures. When I finish my opening comments today and some of the comments on the panel, I won't be able to tell you the future because I can't tell the future. But you'll know how we at Enterprise Products think about the future. And that's the best that I can hope for. The other thing that'll happen is I'll skip through some slides. There's been a number of great presenters here today. So I'll if it's a topic that we've already covered, I'll touch on it, but I won't really take a deep dive. But there will be 2 or 3 slides that you haven't seen and you probably won't see. And so I'll take a deeper dive into those. Here's our view of production. I have the pleasure of leading a technical team at Enterprise. It's a group of geoscientists, so geologists, petroleum engineers. And we look at about 90 to 100 basins across the United States continually. We forecast who's going to be the winners and losers and how across those. About 5 years ago, we started publishing those forecasts because it matters a whole lot to our customer base, both on the producer side and on the consumer side. So anytime you go to Enterprise's investor materials, you'll see what our latest view of production is. Again, think of this as a picture, but let's look at oil production. Other people have talked about this today. I'll put some numbers to it. I'll start here with 2010 and at 2022. Those are our forecasts between 17 and 22. So with crude oil, we're up 4 million barrels between 2010 and 2017. We think we'll add another, call it 3.5 to 4 million barrels between now and 2022, so phenomenal growth. Natural gas, going down the page to the bottom left, production has increased from, call it 58 BCF a day to currently about 77 BCF a day. We think we're rapidly going to 97 BCF a day. And that's because that's how we see market developing. A lot of it's going to be the LNG market that Meg is going to address. Our production on natural gas is limited only to our lack of markets. We firmly believe that this number needed to be 117, 125. Given a 3 to 5 year time period, you can see natural gas demand coming. The U.S. producer could respond, no problem. Permian oil production there, just to show you that it's gone from less than 1 million barrels a day. We think at 2022 it'll be somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million barrels a day. So people have talked about the Permian, and I thought that everyone understands that just the quality of that. I thought Bobby Tudor did a really good job in comparing, contrasting it to other big fields around the world. And NGL production is where I'll probably show you some slides that I'm the only one to show them here today. We have doubled our capacity to produce natural gas liquids, and we think we'll double them again between now and 2022. So let me tell you what natural gas liquids are real quickly and what they're used for. So that's ethane, that's propane, that's butane, and that's natural gasoline. Ethane being the lightest of those is either left in the gas stream or it's used in the petrochemical community. Today, we leave about 1/3 of our produced ethane in the gas stream and get much lower natural gas value for it, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. The next two categories are propane and butane, and we call those collectively LPG, liquid petroleum gases. They are used in the chemicals industry. They're used somewhat in the fuels industry as far as motor fuels. And we use them in our barbecue pits, but I'll tell you there's a number of countries that use them for heat, both for cooking and heating for their home, and that's growing, so we will focus on that some today. So there are numbers, they're all going up sharply and to the right, and no different than what other people are telling you. This is probably a slide that no one's showing here today. It's our own work. It's pretty simple. We believe that there's beauty in simplicity. All we did is we looked at prices for 2008 for oil and natural gas, and we looked at prices for 2016. We put 2010 in there. We ran a little model and said, what's the kind of savings that we've seen between 2008 and 2016? And we calculated that from a cumulative standpoint, stopped at 2016. And if we, on the trend we're on between oil and natural gas savings for consumption in the United States, we've saved $2.3 trillion so far through the end of 2016. That's a massive number. That's a number that contributes to the GDP. It contributes to our balance of trade, and it contributes to jobs. I put a note on there so you can put it in perspective, because once you get to billions and trillions, they're just zeros. But the QE program that our kids will be paying for the great financial bailout, so the first QE program was $1.1 trillion. We're talking about something that's over double the size of that in savings on hydrocarbons because of the shale revolution over a 7-year time period. And other people have shown this slide. I'll summarize. Our rig count today is half of what it was in January 15. So when OPEC decided that they were no longer going that they were going to defend their market share and put 3 million barrels incremental oil on the market. So rig counts in the United States, while they've recovered nicely, are only about half of what they were at their peak, but production is right at where it was at its peak. So a number of people have alluded to this today. It's in our forecast. Producers are doing much more with less. And not going to spend too much time on this, but we look at returns in the different basins. And again, this is a picture. I want y'all to understand what the picture says. I drew a black line in there in theoretical investment threshold. It's for half cycle economics, so it doesn't include the cost of geological and geophysical or acquiring the leasehold. It just includes the cost of drilling and producing. Doesn't include G&A costs for a publicly traded company. And what we see is that somewhere around this 30% half cycle return, that producers and capital markets that support them have been compelled to ramp up drilling and completion activity. And the point here is at $55 or at $45, the U.S. producer is very, very profitable. I'm not the first speaker that's told you that today. And the message is the same for natural gas. Again, I'm not the first person that's presented this to you. The only one that really at this 30% half cycle return that begins to maybe drop out is Fayetteville. So why isn't there more gas drilling? It's very simple. There is no market for all of this natural gas until more exports through the form of LNG happen. This is a slide on oil, one that you haven't seen, so I've decided to go ahead and present it to you. And think about those brown colors there at the bottom as being what I'll call sticky imports. So there was a lot of debate in the U.S. that we would not be an exporting nation for oil, even after we said it was legal to do it, as long as we were a large importer of oil. And so what we did is we just looked at the imports of oil in the United States, and we said, okay, which ones will go away? Which ones have the means to go away? And I would suggest to you that imports from Canada are not going to go away. Imports into PAD 5, so think California, are not going to go away because where they're situated geographically. Imports into PAD 1, so think the Northeast, are not going to go away because of the Jones Act. Makes that oil want to come from other places. And imports from Saudi Arabia, from Mexico and Venezuela, largely are not going to go away. So thus you have the concept of sticky imports. So as you grow the oil volumes that I've showed you that we're on the path to grow, maybe even more, there's only really, and unless you expand your refinery significantly, which we're not in the process of doing, there's really only one thing that's going to happen to the oil, and that is going to be exported. So for those of you that watched the EIA data on Wednesday mornings at 9:30, EIA yesterday said that for oil exports, we hit a record 1.5 million barrels a day. So the trend towards above that light blue line is well on its way, in our opinion. So now let's switch to natural gas liquids, and I'm going to talk about ethane. So remember I told you that we are rejecting back into the natural gas stream about 1/3 of our ethane today, so some 500,000 to 600,000 barrels a day. Ethane demand is much like natural gas demand in that I promise you, you can see it coming because it takes years to permit and to build these plants that use ethane. So the beauty of using NGLs, natural gas liquids, in the chemicals process is that you take a hydrocarbon and rather than combust it, you crack it. So it has a very small carbon footprint when you do that. The other thing that happens when you use NGLs in this manner is you make some very energy efficient things out of it. Things like composites and plastics that replace things like steel, which aren't clean when you make them and are heavy when you use them. So the international and the domestic petrochemical industries understand what the U.S. has relative to natural gas liquids, and they're in the process of expanding the ability to make ethylene in the U.S. by some 50% over a time-year period. I've never seen in a commodity, I've never seen growth of this magnitude. Literally, we're going to increase our capability to make to make ethylene. That's one of the building blocks of plastics by 50% in 5 years. It's coming. These plants are coming on as we speak. The numbers are large. And I would suggest to you that this is the first wave that you see on this page. So call it 800,000 barrels a day. Remember, I told you we're rejecting 600 as we speak. And we're talking to people at Enterprise about a second wave of these plants that would come on in the early 2020s. So it's a phenomenal story. Most of them are oriented towards ethane. We're also exporting our ethane. So we export it by pipeline into Canada, into both Western Canada and Eastern Canada. And we are building export terminals. This happens to be a picture of export terminal that Enterprise put into service in the fourth quarter of last year. It's a 200,000 barrel a day notional capacity, largely spoken for a long period of time for ethane exports. And it's in the process of, those sales are in the process of ramping up. This is a nighttime picture of it. It's actually at Morgan's Point in the Houston Ship Channel. We're very proud of the complex. Now to LPG. So remember, I told you that that's propane and butane. Enterprise Products is the largest exporter of LPG in the world. Hard to believe, but we are. The United States, far and away, as far as market share in LPG, is the largest exporter of LPG into global markets. So it's got durable demand. It comes from both oil and natural gas, and it's somewhat of the forgotten molecule, these LPG molecules. The blue is what I want you to focus on in this picture. That's our projection of LPG demand in the United States. So it is flat at best. So the yellow, orange for years that are actual rather than forecast, the yellow is what we believe our capacity to export is, and the green line is the growth in what we foresee between now and 2022 for LPG production in the United States. Again, remember that's propane and butane. So what we project is that the demand in the United States will remain flat. It's actually falling largely about 2% a year, but we're building some PDH plants and we're building an IBDH plant to drink some of this. But if we're going to produce it, and it cannot be left in the gas stream and it cannot be left in the oil stream, it's going to be exported. And that is what has happened. It's why we're the largest exporter of these products in the world, and that's what is going to continue to happen. So where does it go? 3 years ago, the bulk of it went to Latin America. But in 2015, we expanded our export capability not once but twice, and others in the midstream sector did also. And what we're seeing now is over 50% of these exports are going to Asia. I just took two countries, because they're the two that matter the most, China and India, and showed you since 2010, what their capacity is to consume this. You've had a six-time increase since 2013 in China and double in India. These countries, in aggregate, import about 45% of their LPG needs, and this number is going to increase. And the second line that I have there is really important, and that is that a large portion of this demand is consumer-oriented and relatively price inelastic. I remember when my great aunts went to propane, when they got propane tanks. And one in particular, till the day she died, she didn't have an indoor restroom. But once she went to propane, she never went back to wood. I remember when my dad went to propane. My dad always kept a big fireplace in his house, but once he put the propane tank outside, he didn't go back to a wood stove to cook on. That's going to happen in other countries. I'll go to the next slide. This is very durable demand. Picture on the left is in Indonesia, and the two on the right are in India. What you have with LPG is you have an energy that you can move a fair amount of energy in a small space. So what's happening is we've developed tanks. The industries have developed tanks where you can carry LPG. And these governments largely are subsidizing LPG because they want people to quit cutting down wood, and they want them to put a clean source of heat in their homes. So for the NGL side of the equation, this demand globally is extremely durable. You know, we've had a lot of discussion today here about peak oil, and everybody has an opinion on that. I would tell you by looking at that picture, you don't hear discussion about peak LPG demand, and this is the reason that you don't. Since it's a gas panel, I'll just lay the groundwork for Meg. This is how we see the LNG capacity, you know, increasing. I'm sure she's going to go through it. But it's really important. Remember, U.S. producers are extremely competitive. The small molecule of methane is the easiest one to produce out of tight formations like shales. And natural gas is extremely, extremely plentiful in the U.S. and will be for years to come. Potential Gas Committee is a group of volunteer geoscientists. A lady that works for Enterprise is actually the president of the Potential Gas Committee. They just came out with a report. They report every other year, and they said at current demand that we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 years of natural gas today, just in what we have developed today. So those are really big numbers. We have a plentiful amount of natural gas. And then this is my last slide. U.S. natural gas exports to Mexico have doubled since 2014, and they are expected to double again in the 2025 timeframe. So that's if you don't know by now, this is how we think. 3 years ago, we didn't have a single deep water ship dock, didn't own a single one. Today we have 19. That's how we think. Those are my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, for setting me up so nicely to talk about LNG. So I'm Meg Gentle. I'm CEO of a relatively new company called Tellurian. Who are we? We are a group of people that formed in February of 2016 to build liquefaction infrastructure in the US. We are actually building a global gas business. We took the company public in February of this year, so we're now traded on the NASDAQ, and we have been focusing really over the last 12 months on building a team of very experienced natural gas and LNG professionals to put together the entire value chain of a natural gas business that really reintegrates the model like we've never seen before in the US. So let me start with a few comments on LNG fundamentals around the world. Relatively low commodity prices have supported a lot of demand growth, actually way more than I think the industry has expected. We were growing LNG demand in 2014 at only about 1%, and you can see here how that is now, for the first half of 2017, about a 12% demand growth. Even though we have added a lot of liquefaction capacity to the market over the last several years, we have returned to a very high utilization rate and are now using our effective liquefaction capacity on a global basis around 98%. If we continue to support LNG demand growth globally at 12% demand growth, we will be short in 2018. So there's a lot of talk in the market about oversupply, and I will say that, in my opinion, oversupply is over. We are really going to struggle as an industry to bring on enough liquefaction capacity to meet global demand by 2025. As we look at moderate demand growth, we know that we need over 100 million tons of additional liquefaction capacity to reach construction starting this year over the next 5-year period to meet that kind of demand by 2025. And as we look at the opportunity around the world today, we think that about 60 or 70% of that is actually going to be called on the U.S. to deliver, because we know today that the U.S. is really the lowest cost place for new LNG development when you consider the cost to produce the gas and the capital cost to build the infrastructure. The graph all the way on the right shows netback prices in the U.S. Gulf Coast. And finally, after several years of fairly low prices, I think 2016 average price in the Gulf was only about $4.50 an MMBTU. But finally, the price signal is there with the Gulf Coast marker for October, I think now at about $6.80 an MMBTU, and for November, over $7. This follows, obviously, high prices in Europe and Asia, with Asian winter prices now showing between $9 and $10 an MMBTU. So today, the signal is clearly there. Please build more export capacity from the US. Everything is changing about the LNG business, and finally, we are showing signs of becoming more like the oil business, and actually more like the LPG business, where there is increasing liquidity. This is a map that shows all the LNG vessels on the water today, so almost 500 LNG vessels, which by 2020, which will be almost 600 LNG carriers on a worldwide basis. This means that those vessels represent about the equivalent amount of LNG storage, almost 700 BCF of LNG storage. That's roughly the same, a little bit more actually, than the combined above-ground storage of Japan and Korea, which really means that on a global basis, consumers can finally rely on the supply of LNG and the liquidity in the market to deliver gas whenever they need it. This is putting a lot of pressure to change the contracting structures in the LNG business and go away from long-term 20-year agreements to shorter tenors with greater flexibility and lower cost. So in that context, we've been exploring how can we listen to the requests from the market for greater flexibility in contracting, for equity participation in the project, and try to deliver a model that responds to those requests. And what we found is that we really need to participate in all parts of the value chain to deliver absolutely the lowest cost LNG possible. Our core business has started in pipelines and liquefaction. And you probably know that we have a project, as Molly said, thank you, in Louisiana on the Calcasieu Channel, which I will talk about a little bit more, but it is a 27.5 million ton facility to export LNG from Louisiana. And we have filed the permitting for that facility together with a driftwood pipeline, which is a little bit less than 100-mile pipeline that will source gas from multiple liquidity points in Louisiana. We have also purchased almost 10,000 acres of producing property in the Haynesville Shale in North Louisiana. It has today only about 4 million cubic feet a day of production, but about 140 drilling locations that we will develop over the next several years to prepare us to be more integrated as we're producing LNG from driftwood in about 2022. The important thing about that production is that it's very flexible from the Haynesville. All of the acreage is held by production, so we can be very flexible in how we drill that. And we know that we can deliver that gas to the market in South Louisiana for about $2.25 an MMBTU. That'll mean that LNG is on the water in the Gulf Coast for about $3 an MMBTU. which is really one of the cheapest sources of natural gas for the global market. And then all the way on the right, the next big step that we have to do is prove out our capability to actually deliver LNG on vessels to customers in their markets. And we will be trading LNG by the end of this year. So putting together all those pieces of the value chain is really just laying the groundwork for us to be able to offer a different business model to LNG buyers, which actually we think of for us as a new business model. It is a new business model for the development of US liquefaction, but it is in fact the old business model for development of LNG projects worldwide, and that is that the buyers of LNG, or the consumers of the gas, want an equity participation in the project. So we know that across the entire business, production, pipelines, liquefaction, the total cost of all of those combined is about $1,500 a ton. The liquefaction itself, we have been able to drive economies of scale and get the capex for the liquefaction down to about $550 a ton. But on a combined basis, the total equity of the project will be about $1,500 a ton to customers. And the LNG can still be delivered in the Gulf Coast for about $3 an MMBTU. So what does that mean? That means that it's very easy to compare $3 an MMBTU delivered compared to whatever the price is in the market in the Gulf. And today it's about $7 an MMBTU, so you've got $4 of margin. The LNG business has actually been pretty volatile, and we've seen netback prices in the Gulf anywhere from $4.50 to $18, which really means that, you know, the range of margin is anywhere from $1.50 to $15 an MMBTU. You can see how that business model provides a lot of opportunity for equity participants. And I was giving an interview a few days ago, and the reporter was asking me, you know, why can customers start relying on the spot market for LNG compared to long-term contracts? And I was saying, you know, I had an interesting experience during Hurricane Harvey because we eat eggs in my house every single day. And right after Hurricane Harvey was the only day ever that I have not been able to go to the grocery store and buy eggs. So the liquidity in the LNG business is becoming just like that. Nobody signs a long-term contract to buy eggs. You just go to the supermarket and pay whatever price eggs are on the day. Here's a little bit about Driftwood LNG. It is a project on a very large piece of land, 1,000 acres near Lake Charles, Louisiana. It has capacity for 27.6 million tons. We have some very important partners, technology providers in the project. Bechtel is going to do all of our construction. GE will provide the power generation and refrigerant compressor equipment, and Chart Industries will provide all of the refrigeration technology. We have really tried to push the envelope of technology here and get the refrigeration units of LNG to be smaller and smaller. So a kind of traditional train in the US today is about 4.5 or 5 million tons. And we have designed this trying to find an assembly line process way of producing the refrigerators. So we have 1.4, 1.3 million ton refrigerators. So it's really a good example of how technology can drive down costs in an industry. As we're trying to meet the needs of a more commoditized market where low cost has to be the thing that finds winners. So I guess my main conclusions, LNG demand is growing actually very rapidly, expanding 12% in the first half of this year. We think that the US is very well positioned to meet the demand in the market, and in fact the market will need the US to maybe even double the capacity that's under construction today. Netback prices in the Gulf Coast have finally signaled that is needed with wide enough margins to support the investment needed for that kind of construction. And we believe that reintegrating the model is going to provide customers with low-cost gas production and low-cost capital and liquefaction, and that will be the thing that results in the most competitive LNG in the world. Thank you.
Because I usually end up following her. So my name is Roberto Simon, and I work for Societe Generale. I am responsible for our energy business in the United States. For those of you that don't know SocGen, we're a large European institution, French actually, and we have been extremely active in energy as we define it, which is oil and gas and power, for quite some time. LNG specifically, we have a 20-year history as an advisor and arranger of financing for LNG transactions, both internationally and then extremely active here in the United States as advisor and underwriter for, I think, for every project that's been done to date. What I thought I would do is, you know, what's been laid out so far is kind of what the demand and supply is in the sector, a little bit how the industry is changing, and that obviously poses challenges for those of us who are tasked with raising capital for these transactions. And so if you'd all bear with me, I'll spend maybe 3 minutes talking about how the industry has changed very rapidly, and I can break it down pre-2012, post-2012, and then we'll call it post-2018. So as Meg alluded to, pre-2012, the world was pretty simple. Natural gas was a domestic business. I remember speaking to my colleagues in London. We were having a call on global LNG. This was like 2009, and they talked about, you know, global LNG, and those of us in the U.S. kind of scoffed because most of us were power guys. For us, natural gas was something used to fire power plants and convert into propane and so on. But the LNG business globally was really a point-to-point business. So the whole purpose of LNG was to monetize stranded gas from markets that didn't have, from countries that didn't have a market for their natural gas. The players in that market were the majors, the IOCs, and state-owned companies. And they entered into long-term 20-year contracts, as Meg said, to basically monetize that gas and sell it to countries that didn't have natural resources, you know, mostly Japan and a few others. Pretty simple model, pretty straightforward, 20-year contracts. The folks that financed those transactions, which were multi-billion-dollar transactions, were European banks, for the most part, and export credit agencies supporting their champions, their equipment suppliers. Kind of fast forward to 2012, and I picked 2012 because that's when the first Sabine transaction was financed, and we acted as a financial advisor to Cheniere on that transaction. The whole model changed. We went from large developers, large companies developing these projects that were geared to monetize natural gas or stranded gas to a market where now we had a relatively small developer in Cheniere at that time. Freeport was another small developer that were looking to take advantage of low-cost natural gas in the United States. In a country that had, you know, abundance of infrastructure to transport that gas, and therefore a high level of reliability that you could obtain that gas. So the play now wasn't monetizing stranded gas because there's a home for U.S. gas in domestic markets and in Mexico and so on. The play was really an arbitrage between Henry Hub and the price of oil, because in the old model, LNG was priced off an oil index, JCC. And 2010, 11, 12, price of oil, if I remember correctly, was still hovering somewhere 70, 75, maybe higher, I can't remember. So at that point, Henry Hub, which was still hovering around $2.50, $3, was extremely competitive when you converted it into an MMBTU basis, landed anywhere in the world. In fact, I think at every conference I attended, in fact, I think in some of the presentations Cheniere used to have, you'd see landed cost, JCC was at $18 an MMBTU, cost of US LNG was going to be at $11 landed MMBTU. So huge arbitrage. And therefore, there were a lot of buyers for that. Long-term contracts, either a capacity payment to the supplier or a tolling structure, but basically there was no commodity price risk for the project itself or for the institutions financing those projects. And the market shifted a little bit. The institutions financing those projects were still the banks, but now it was just to finance construction, and all this paper was going out into the U.S. capital markets, deepest, most liquid market in the world. That market worked fairly well, and that model worked fairly well. I think over $50 billion of debt was raised, several $billion of equity, both private equity and money from the players themselves. And it worked extremely well until the price of oil collapsed. And so when the price of oil collapsed, all of a sudden that arbitrage between Henry Hub and JCC disappeared. And the game has now become, who is the low-cost producer? And as Meg said, it's a little bit back to the future. The model is now either virtually through contracts, yet to be seen, or actually through ownership of upstream and liquefaction plants, going to be an integrated model. Both equity and debt are going to be exposed to commodity price risk to one degree or another. The market itself is now looking very global, because the buyers of LNG can now take their LNG anywhere in the world. We have traders much more actively involved. We have aggregators who are selling to various markets on a short-term basis, much more actively involved. So the challenge we have on my side of the world is where do we place this paper? So liquidity is not an issue. There's a bazillion dollars of both debt and equity floating around the world. That's not the problem. The problem is, what's the risk-reward component? What's the structure? How much reward and how much risk are both debt and equity going to be asked to take, and therefore what's the reward they're going to receive for that? And really the challenge at this point is it's unknown, because we don't know what the structures look like. So we have a data point, which is Tellurian, which will be tested. Full disclosure, we're an advisor to Tellurian, so we believe in the model. But there are others out there developing their own models, and I'll say that I don't think there's going to be a model. I think the Tellurian model is a perfectly good model. There are others that firmly believe they're still going to get long-term contracts, and logic would dictate, if there's going to be a shortage, as has been laid out, then some utilities, those entities that may want more reliability of their source of supply, might be interested in entering into those contracts at the right price. But again, we're really looking a lot more, less like a utility model, which I think was the model before, in the US at least, and much more like a commodity model. And in commodities, as I'm sure you all know, winners are low-cost suppliers, because you're going to have to withstand the troughs in the cycle. So in conclusion, I think over the next 3 years, we're going to see another $40–50 billion raised in the market, both bank market, export credit agencies, and ultimately the capital markets. There's ample liquidity. And for those of us that really are allowing folks like Tellurian do all the heavy lifting, we're just waiting to see who the winners are going to be. And given bankers are kind of parasites anyway, we'll kind of end up working with the winners, and hopefully we can have some influence on who those winners are, and some input as to what structures might make sense to provide the lowest source of capital possible. Thank you.
So thanks. It's always a great privilege to talk to this group of decision makers and subject matter experts. So my name is Christopher Smith. I'm a fellow here at the Baker Institute. I, until recently, was an official in the previous administration within the Department of Energy. I was the Assistant Secretary for fossil energy. I had lots of opportunities to engage with the Baker Institute in my time in government, and now I've got the pleasure to be a part of this institute. So it's great to be talking cleanup because I get to, I won't reiterate all of the comments that the panel's already made. I'll try to tee up a few topics for discussion for, our back and forth here coming in a minute. And I'll try to make a couple of points from the point of view of someone who looked at some of these processes from the government side, and also kind of try to tie that into some observations about markets. So I'll make 4 broad points here in my comments. I'll talk a little bit about markets and how they're kind of evolving in the current geopolitical context. Talk a little bit about the role of gas and some of the challenges that were raised by Secretary Baker in his comments on climate and dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, and a little bit about the changing approach towards fossil energy and climate between the previous administration and the current administration, which is always a topic of interest. So first observation is that as we look at the current kind of geopolitical and political environment here in the United States, that business cycles are certainly very much longer than political cycles. So as we watch the fluctuations of the issue of the moment at any given point of time, there is a very long continuum of how markets evolve and how businesses react to those market realities. There's been a lot of discussion about the decision to withdraw from Paris on the Clean Power Plan and other things that have occurred. But one thing that you see in the behavior of companies and that you expect going forward is that there's going to be continued pressure to think about low carbon sources of energy. And herein lies, a potential opportunity for natural gas and its continued participation in the market. As you look at the progress that has been made in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the biggest piece of that has come from switching from coal to natural gas. Anthony, in his comments in the slide that he showed, really showed the impact of shale gas and the technologies around shale gas and reducing the cost of natural gas. And when you look at that overall impact, a lot of that has gone to switching from coal to natural gas. That is expected to continue, even as we see, wherever the future, the price for natural gas goes, and the future of immediate regulations. One thing that we certainly do see as companies are making decisions about how they deploy capital, that if you're going to build a power plant, if you're going to be deciding how you're going to build new power generation, there's going to be a real driver to consider what is going to be the evolution of the regulatory environment, not just over the next 2 years or 3 years, but the next, over the course of decades. And so as you make a multi-billion-dollar investment, what we're seeing is that it's going to be difficult to allocate that capital to something like a coal-fired power plant with the expectation that the current environment is going to last over the multi-decade period that it takes to make a return on those investments. Along with the other things that came from the Paris Agreement, one of the things that you expect to keep going forward is there was an agreement called the Breakthrough Coalition that came along with the Paris discussions, which was a commitment to match public spending on low energy R&D with a series of funds that would allocate capital to patient capital projects that were dedicated to low carbon sources. And those projects continue to move forward. Those funds are still going to be available. There's still a lot of uncertainty around how to actually allocate those investments, but that's going to continue to be a force going forward. Which kind of takes me to the second point I was going to mention, which is in all of this, LNG is going to continue to be a big opportunity, but there's still certainly some challenges and I think some steps that the industry needs to make in order to achieve its full potential. It's been a long evolution for LNG in the United States. I was before I was at the Department of Energy, I was at Chevron for a number of years. And I actually worked on the Sabine Pass project back in the late 90s and early 2000s when that was actually an LNG import terminal. And so, seeing that go from, being the private sector, seeing it on that side, then going to the public sector and working on that same project as an export terminal shows that it's very difficult to make any predictions about the distant future with any accuracy. But the U.S. has currently authorized over 20 billion cubic feet of supply per day in terms of exports. There's been a series of detailed public interest determinations that went into all of those into all of those export licenses that have been offered. Part of that public interest determination is looking at, well, what is the greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas and of LNG. And the studies that were commissioned by the Department of Energy over the last few years essentially came to the conclusion that when you compare LNG to other sources of electricity that they would be displacing internationally, that you don't see that LNG exports would increase greenhouse gas emissions, and on that basis, that was one of the underlying factors that backstopped the decisions that the Department of Energy made. There's some opportunities to make sure that we're optimizing those benefits. However, as you look at, what are the steps that the extractive industries can take in terms of ensuring they address fugitive methane emissions? How can you ensure that these processes are as clean as possible so that you can demonstrate in the future as these concerns increase that this truly is the cleanest process that you can manage. In addition, the gas industry is going to be interested in new evolutions and new technologies in terms of how natural gas is consumed. There's a truly interesting project that's being conducted by Net Power, which is a demonstration of advanced supercritical CO2, using CO2 in the combustion cycle, that has the benefit of a much higher efficiency, but also captures the CO2 as part of that process, so it can be easily collected, compressed, and used in enhanced oil recovery or other uses. Those technologies are going to be important for the future of natural gas. The third thing to point that I want to make is that other countries, as they look at the process here in the United States, other countries are going to learn from the trial and error process that we've gone through here as the markets have developed LNG. I had the opportunity to participate in the IEA process back in several years ago in Poland, when there was lots of excitement about shale gas in Eastern Europe. Certainly there have been some real challenges there that's been driven by market structure, ownership of subsurface rights, access to infrastructure that you need to produce the gas, but also the geology. But as you look at efforts being made in China, now in Argentina, which I think does have some potentially really attractive subsurface characterizations in terms of the geology is more amenable to production. You're going to see, hopefully, in some places, some countries making some headway that comes from, again, the extensive trial and error process that we've gone through here in the United States. And last thing I'll mention just briefly, that maybe tee up some of our discussion, is how do all these things come together in the current political environment? So as you look at I guess the most recent slogan or term that you hear out of the Department of Energy is this idea of energy dominance, of U.S. energy dominance. And there'll be some questions about, well, what does that mean? How do you implement that in practical terms? What are the policy implications of that approach? In some ways, it's a sort of a more muscular formulation of the idea of energy independence, which was a term that it was always sort of questionable in terms of the idea of any level of energy independence in a fundamentally interdependent world. When you're looking at a fungible commodity like oil and now liquefied natural gas. But as we look at the current environment and what can you actually do to realize this promise or take this potential and do something with it, LNG is going to be an element of that. Certainly, as you look at countries like Japan, who are major buyers, they're well supplied, but there's going to be potentially a driver to consume more LNG from United States and Japan, as there's a desire to demonstrate that they're making some progress in dealing with the trade balance between Japan and the United States. So what will that mean for U.S. Producers? What will that mean for off-takers in Japan? And the last point along those lines is the relationship with Mexico. So in the Department of Energy, there's a lot of scrutiny that goes into the public interest determination that is attached to liquefied natural gas, LNG, as that's being exported, and those orders had to be written. But the ongoing work of the department in terms of permitting, a lot of it goes towards that relationship with Mexico. There's, under Section 3 of the Natural Gas Act, there's two categories of export. There's export to free trade agreement countries and exports to countries with which the United States does not have a free trade agreement. All the Mexico exports certainly fall in that first category of countries with which the U.S. has a free trade agreement. If that should change, under this ongoing discussion around NAFTA, it would certainly have an impact on that, potentially on that cross-border trade as we look at, well, how does the U.S. use that potentially new lever in its negotiations with Mexico. So with that, perhaps I'll pause. I look forward to the Q&A session, and thanks to the rest of my panelists.
And just a quick reminder as we start moving into the Q&A portion that if you do have questions that you'd like to pass along, to just bring those to the aisles. Oh, thank you. Very productive with questions while everybody was speaking. So to start off with, there's a lot of discussion, both this morning and in each of your presentations about, the very plentiful amount of natural gas that we have. And so the focus is really on the demand side. So kind of pressure testing that a little bit about, drivers on the demand side and growing, that demand. In particular, if prices are changing and that's starting to create demand now, what are the sensitivities that could change that going forward? So Meg, I was going to kind of start with you to get your views on how how you might see pricing in the future impacting the stability of that demand.
So I think that overall, at least 75% of the demand growth in LNG is coming from Asia. And China and India are very important components of that demand growth. And in fact, I was reading an article, I think 2 days ago, that reflected Chinese demand growth year over year for the first 8 months of the year, up 40%, which I was actually amazed that was even more than I think people are expecting. By the same token, China and India tend to be the most price-sensitive parts of the market, as they're trying to displace coal and really clean the air in their cities, which I didn't fully appreciate until the first time I went to Beijing and could not see the building 2 blocks down the street. That there's really, really a desperate need to reduce coal-fired power and replace that with a combination of gas and renewables. And that means that it's not just the price of gas, but it's also the interplay between the price of gas and the price of coal that kind of forms a little bit of the pace of growth in demand for natural gas and for LNG. In general, the worldwide demand for natural gas has historically been very, very steady at about 2% a year, a little bit less than that even. And the worldwide gas market is about 365 BCF a day of natural gas, of which, North America is about 85 BCF a day. And Europe is probably 45 BCF a day. So that means that, every year we have 50 BCF a day of additional demand growth for natural gas. And a little over 30% of that needs to come from LNG, which is how we get to our need for new liquefaction capacity, about 20 million tons a year of new liquefaction capacity, or at least 100 million tons over the next several years. So, we look to that kind of steady growth, and then we try to anticipate where our unexpected places that growth is exceeding that, and I would look to really China and India for their growth rate, and also places in the Middle East and South Asia that have been unexpected new markets. So Pakistan, Bangladesh, Jordan, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, that were consuming zero LNG a few years ago, and nobody had them in their forecast, and are now all of a sudden installing floating storage and regasification units, and within 12 months becoming importers of LNG. So overall, I think that the growth in LNG demand is going to surprise us on the upside, not on the downside. But having said that, as more and more liquidity comes into the market, price-sensitive places like China and India can play off of the interplay between other fuels for their alternatives.
I don't know if anyone else had thoughts they wanted to add.
I would just add a couple things from our perspective. LNG is a replacement fuel. Natural gas is a replacement fuel. It's either coal, the Caribbean, it's replacing bunker fuel. So mostly it's for power generation. So clearly relative cost is going to be an issue. Secondly, infrastructure to both import that LNG, then distribute that LNG as natural gas is huge. And in a lot of the countries we're talking about, India and China being the largest drivers, the ability for them to build that infrastructure to distribute it so that it can be used effectively is going to be critical. The next element from us, which affects us here in the U.S. In many ways, is and abroad. I'll put it broadly, public policy. So when we're talking about power, particularly in the developing world, electricity, it's very it affects everybody, and therefore it's often used in developing countries as a lever to keep people happy, keep populations calm. Both natural gas and electricity are very controlled commodities. And that obviously has an influence on demand, because you can increase and decrease your demand for the product based on how you price it. And if you're pricing it in a centralized economy, you're really not getting very strong price signals. And so from our side, when we're trying and look out and take a view as to what the demand is going to be, or rate of growth in demand, those things can affect the rate of growth. And then lastly, particularly viewing it from developed countries, it is environmental and change in technology. So the power panel is very interesting, because the whole debate, as I understood it, was how quickly will technology change your mix of energy, from renewables to more traditional, either coal or nat gas. And it's unknown. I mean, who 50 years ago or 30 years ago would have predicted that coal would no longer be supreme in the United States? When I started in the business and we were financing gas-fired power plants, we talked about, we had 20-year power purchase agreements with utilities. We were more concerned about natural gas running out in the U.S. than we were about the power plants, the CCGTs becoming obsolete. Look how much the world has changed in a relatively short period of time. I won't say how many years that's been, because I don't want to date myself too much. So I don't know how quickly battery technology is going to change, how solar is going to change. The rate of change is amazing, but all that's going to have an effect on demand for natural gas, which is now clearly a transition fuel. And then the last element I'll put in, particularly for development of projects here in the United States, is how environmental policy and how the reaction of constituents in the United States respond to that environmental policy, and how courts interpret environmental regulations. And so I will use as data points the issues that the oil industry is having in building oil pipelines. They're having a lot of trouble building oil pipelines, and cost is going up because they're tied up in court for extended period of time. Dakota is built but still in court. Trans Mountain in Canada hasn't started construction, tied up in court. From our side, on the debt side, where capital markets really don't like instability or uncertainty, the fact that courts or administrations or even NGOs can change the way they attack the problem and therefore create uncertainty and increase cost is an issue, which causes us concern.
I just want to build on one point that you mentioned around new markets and energy poverty. So as you look at, we focus on the traditional markets, on China and Japan, on Europe, but there'll be emerging opportunities, and for example, for places like in the Caribbean that are now, with this ongoing human tragedy with the hurricanes, are going to be in a position of rethinking about rebuilding and how they look at their energy infrastructure. And these are areas that are paying, 40, 50 cents per kilowatt hour, extremely high prices based on fuel oil, simply because that's the option that they have, and they don't have access to natural gas because historically the business models haven't been amenable to bringing natural gas shipments into those relatively small markets. But as FSRUs are being deployed in different parts of the world, there is the potential to bring lower cost electricity to populations that are actually paying quite high prices. And there's idea that it's difficult to supply some of these markets because people don't have the ability to pay. But in many cases, the challenges. You can't get the investment in place to allow people to pay less than the very high prices that they're currently paying. We're currently looking at some issues with market structure and commercial models and small-scale technologies that allow people to pay using smart metering that can dramatically reduce the risk of making investments in markets in Africa and elsewhere. And as we look at these new commercial models, it will, hopefully it will make some market participants rethink the idea of putting in place FSRUs in places where you could use that to get natural gas and electricity to underserved populations.
I'd like to add one thing. While Meg's industry is the big consumer for U.S. gas, it's not us in this room, because we're putting new windows in our houses and more efficient heaters and all of that kind of thing. So she is the big consumption and what producers are looking forward to. There's a second one that none of us have discussed, and that's industrial demand for things like methanol and ammonia and fertilizers. And those are GDP related. It makes us capable of exporting our natural gas also. So about 30% of the demand growth that we see now between now and 2025 is this industrial GDP-oriented demand. So it's another important piece that I didn't bring up in my conversation.
And one of the questions from the audience is maybe somewhat related to a question for you, Tony, of, is there a market for methanol beyond its current use? Could it, be a, do you, something like clean vehicle fuels, what do you view?
I haven't studied methanol in cars. I've spent a little more time thinking about hydrogen fuel cells, quite frankly. Methanol to olefins is being applied in Asia a fair amount, but frankly, they are struggling at this point to compete with olefins made from ethane and from PDHs from propane. So whether or not, it's not that I'm not a student of that technology, but because we're a supplier into that market and we watch their margins have been lagging. It's very hard for them to compete with ethane and propane at this point, it appears.
As we're talking about the growing demand, particularly in the overseas markets, what are the kind of distribution challenges that you see, and or how have you overcome some of those from the standpoint of just kind of transitions and what we've seen? Are there do you feel like we have a huge kind of period of growth in terms of additional distribution needs?
I think that it matters somewhat whether the LNG is coming in or gas is coming into the country and being used for power generation versus for, local and residential. I mean, residential and industrial or commercial use is a very important use of natural gas and actually a very efficient use of gas for heating. But obviously it requires, a rather extensive distribution network, pipelines that can distribute gas throughout the population. It's much easier to have an LNG facility built right next to a power generation facility, which could be a 600 megawatt facility or several thousand megawatt facility. And then you need the infrastructure to distribute the power. But if you're displacing coal, a lot of those transmission lines are already there. So it really depends from region to region or country to country what is the need in that region. But I would say that definitely there is a lot of investment on the other side of the plant, either in transmission lines or distribution networks for pipeline gas to move the LNG into the country. And that sometimes takes a lot more years to construct than the import terminal itself. And then I would say the second challenge is that infrastructure, really to reach the market efficiently and to foster competition, has to have open access. And we in the US are really a great example of open access infrastructure where people can take long-term contracts on pipelines, but there's also capacity that gets released back into the market, and it's available for anybody who would like to use it at the prevailing tariff. That isn't true in every place around the world. And actually, Chris mentioned the U.S. policy for energy dominance, some of which is actually quite pointed toward Eastern Europe as we try to provide them with energy security and a supply alternative to Russia. One challenge in that part of the world is that the Russians control the pipelines to distribute the gas because they've signed for long-term contracts. So hand in hand with bringing new supply, we have to look to the other side to have infrastructure that is open access and provides competition so that the U.S. really can provide energy competition, not so much energy dominance.
Relative to LPG, I showed you the distribution system for that market, and really that is what it is.
And we always talk about liquidity in the market. There's an abundance of liquidity for certain countries and for certain regions. So when you start moving into Bangladesh, Pakistan, parts of Africa, parts of the Caribbean, appetite starts to drop off. The U.S. capital markets is often shut to those countries because of ratings, or the pockets of appetite are relatively small. So now you're much more dependent on export credit agencies, development banks.
French banks.
Some French banks who have an appetite for those countries and have been there a long time. But the pockets of liquidity start to shrink, and therefore the cost of capital rises, and it becomes much more difficult to build that infrastructure. So it's a limiting factor in trying to get LNG and other commodities that need infrastructure to all parts of the world.
And Chris, I have kind of a follow-up question for you. I know, one of the areas that you focus on is kind of how these transitions in energy, impact different communities that, particularly in emerging, countries. So as we look at, the emerging countries as a source of demand for LNG and LPG, from a policy perspective, are there things that you are concerned about, or impacts the local communities? Is this all positive? Are there things that that we haven't talked about yet of the implications of the change?
All right. Well, that's certainly going to vary, from market to market or from community to community. In a emerging market context, even the conversation we just had around infrastructure, as part of the Escravos project in In Nigeria, there was, and this was late 90s, early 2000s, the construction of the West Africa gas pipeline that goes from Nigeria all the way up through Ghana, with the idea that you would collect all of this natural gas and you put it in the pipeline, and not only would you help incentivize new production, but you could also supply gas throughout the rest of West Africa. And now, we mentioned that the countries are looking at bringing in FSRUs to supply LNG, and Ghana is actually one of them that's connected to a pipeline that's already built and in place because of all the challenges of getting natural gas into those lines. So there are myriad challenges that face some of these markets as they're trying to put in place these capital investments at the same time that they're wrestling with regulatory reform and rule of law issues in many parts of the world. But overall, I think it's an opportunity to bring energy to parts of the world that don't have access to electricity. And again, many of these low-income populations are actually paying quite high prices for the energy that they do consume. And one of the reasons why you pay so much is that you don't have the liquidity and the credit to make more efficient investments. And so as some of the commercial models and technologies come aboard to allow people to prepay even on a very small local level and pull those prepayments in a way that reduces the risk of investments, it's our hope that it will start driving some of those some investments that will increase access to electricity for some of those populations.
Turning to the contracting model and kind of the new business model and how you finance some of the developments in this industry, are there, Roberto, maybe you can start by talking a little bit more, diving into what's really some of the creative ideas that you're seeing come out of this transition.
I don't know if they're creative. I think they're just going to be, they're going to react to reality. Look, I think there's nothing in finance that's really new, right? Everything's variation on a theme. We just kind of cut it up in different ways, package it in a different way. And so what the LNG industry in the U.S. is trying to do today has been done in the past. I mean, Enterprise doesn't need long-term contracts to sell its product. Enterprise sells its product in the market and has no issues raising debt in the markets. And there's a whole bevy of upstream producers, both natural gas and oil producers that do this, distributors, refiners. You can't think of a more difficult business than the refining business. So I think really the challenge is not that we need to be innovative. I think the challenge is to get to the point where we understand what the business model is. And we have the opportunity to explain to the markets what risks they're being asked to take, and therefore the markets have the opportunity to price that risk. So the next wave of LNG may or may not be financed by the same institutions that financed the first wave, yet to be seen. But there is a price point, and there is a structure in which there's capital available, because a lot worse credits than what we're going to see coming out in this next wave get financed, right? That's what the non-investment grade market's for, and we have an investment grade market. I don't think there'll really be anything. I think when we take a look back, people will say, wow, it was kind of simple. Just like the first wave. When we did that first wave, man, we thought we're just breaking every single rule, no completion guarantees, you can take your LNG anywhere you want. No one talks about that anymore. I feel like we didn't do anything. Because it wasn't that big a deal. It was just educating people as to how to understand the risk properly. And I think that's going to be the same exercise here, quite frankly.
That's a plain-spoken statement from a banker, folks.
So shifting a little bit to, government and, regulation and policy side of things, we talked a little bit about Chris, in your comments, talking about the use of the exports as leverage in kind of the geopolitical, situation right now. do you see any, things that you're concerned that might, change kind of the U.S.'s position, in terms of exporting? So much of what we've been talking about, it's all, this change in 2012, right? Do you see anything coming that would change that?
Well, I mean, to be determined. I mean, one of the things that will determine that is how the global market evolves. But when you look at, the role of government in this process, so the government has to do a public interest determination for any application to export liquefied natural gas. The Department of Energy to date has authorized about 20 billion cubic feet of natural gas to be exported, which is, if you compare that to the global LNG market, that is a lot of gas. So there's a question about, what is what impact would incremental volumes on top of that have, which really kind of questions, well, to what degree does the federal government now have a much role in steering the evolution of future markets. But one thing, I mean, if the current administration is kind of continuing along the path that was established by the previous administration in terms of looking at public interest determinations. One thing that is slightly new is you saw Secretary Wilbur Ross make a very public commitment to China around access to LNG, which essentially reiterated the statements that had been made in previous public interest determinations that authorize LNG exporters to send natural gas to any country, including China. But they certainly very, very specifically singled out, China in that Department of Commerce communique. And that could signal a couple things. I mean, first, you could take that as, well, that's a business as usual signal. I mean, that's what's already kind of been stated, if not as explicitly as that. But it also kind of indicates, potential for a more one-on-one transactional approach to the idea of energy policy. That instead of looking at energy policy in a sort of a large holistic way that makes the difficult and imperfect effort to balance all of the puts and takes of the various stakeholders across the spectrum. Instead, it would look at a transactional one-to-one bilateral series of discussions that would lead to a conclusion around a trade with that particular country. So if there's anything that's been new at all in terms of the administration's approach to LNG and international markets, it perhaps would be that signal that was sent in the fact that there was a very specific commitment made to a single country that came out of a bilateral discussion between President Trump and the Chinese at Mar-a-Lago.
So, along kind of similar lines, trying to incorporate some of the questions that have come in from the audience as well. Thinking about what would be the consequences in the U.S. of just some of the instability in other markets. Is there a particular market, that where you see a lot of demand growth that, if there was something that, really shut off your ability to export to that country would have a big impact on your projections, maybe, kind of for Tony and Meg?
I think a significant economic downturn that affected Asia, particularly China, would be very negative for LPG exports. I don't think anyone in this room sees that. It would have to be significant because at this point it's human needs kind of consumption. Mm-hmm. But it's another place that LPG appears to be pretty durable, but on the petrochemical side, it would affect demand worldwide.
I think the same is true for LNG and natural gas. There is a strong correlation with population growth and with GDP. So as things are changing in that front over a long-term basis, that impacts demand. And then, of course, the success of renewables in making step changes in reliability and storage, that is going to be important for natural gas. And natural gas provides a very, very important additional security to any electric network that is trying to rely more and more on renewables, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, so you have to have backup generating capacity. But definitely the success of renewable increase in the overall percentage of electric power generation is an important factor for gas demand.
As we kind of shift a little bit towards technology, maybe kind of priming a little bit for the next panel, can you talk a little bit about just kind of what some of the technological advances are that have made the biggest difference? Tony, maybe you can start with just kind of talking about developments in rigs. Say what it looks like now versus 3 years ago.
Yeah, so we're not an upstream research kind of entity like some other people have been. But so all we do is look in the rearview mirror. And if we go back to 2013 and look at the productivity per rig at the major basins, it's somewhere between 200 and 300% better today. And I'll say something that no one else has said. And when we look at the shales, a lot of people look and go and they say, well, the decline rates are real negative with the shales. If you know anything about net present value, for those of you that run those kind of models, it is the most positive thing that there is about the shales, because you get your money back right up front. It's the best investment you can make. And it's another reason that people are running towards the shales and putting their brain power into money in. So 200 to 300% over a 4-year time period, those are some big numbers, and they're real. The EIA publishes them.
Yeah. And then Meg, I guess, thinking about the the change, or the innovations in the plant and equipment design, or is there anything in particular you'd highlight, thinking about the new project that you all are working on from a technology and innovation standpoint?
I think that, we have found savings, and we're almost finished negotiating our EPC contract, engineering, procurement, and construction contract, which will have a lump sum turnkey, guaranteed fixed price from Bechtel for the entire construction of the plant. So we know now that the cost of the facility is going to come through at roughly $550 a ton, $550 a ton. That compares to, in my own experience, the Sabine Pass CapEx, which from the original marine facilities and storage tanks, and then the liquefaction was about $600 a ton. And then when we designed the Corpus Christi plant, that was the first, completely new, not an expansion from an import terminal, and that had a cost of about $800 a ton. So we came about the challenge to be the lowest cost producer, right, in a commoditizing business, and said to Bechtel, we've got to come back to something that's more like $500 a ton. And we did it in 1,000 different small ways. There was no massive technology change. We're using proven technology from proven technology providers. But we tried to really drive toward that assembly line production process that has never really been able to happen before in the refrigeration unit, because they're very, very large units that are, bespoke with lots of custom parts. Trying to get them to be bigger and bigger. So we said, well, why can't they just be smaller? And then you can produce them the same as GE produces the turbines, like an assembly line, and you'll get efficiencies there. And we found that the design is successful in that. And then it will also be much more reliable, because the maintenance that you have for outages is on a unit that's 1.4 million tons, and it's 1/20th the entire capacity of the plant, instead of 1/3 the entire capacity of the plant. So that's really how we've been able to drive down the cost. And we find that while we were trying to get smaller and smaller, there are still no economies of small in the liquefaction business, and we still have to have a very large facility, which is how we arrived at over 27 million tons of capacity combined. And that has to go together with low cost production of gas. So I agree with Tony that the cost of drilling and production in the U.S., I think, is really what has revolutionized the business for the U.S. as a contributor to the worldwide market, way more than the cost of liquefaction itself.
And Chris, can you talk a little bit about innovation from a safety perspective? And in particular, people thinking about this in light of the recent hurricanes and and production in the Gulf of Mexico, and are there things that you're seeing in your research that are either that have happened recently or that are coming up that you think might make a big difference from a safety perspective?
I guess one thing I can say to that is that reliability is certainly important. Throughout our energy system, as our energy system ages, and there's concern about issues of reliability. The fact that throughout the this hurricane process, you did see the process of offloading at Sabine Pass kind of move forward without any major incidents that I'm aware of. I think increases one's confidence that this is something that can add to the reliability of the overall system and increases one's confidence in the dependability of the U.S. as a supply point in the global market. So perhaps that's one thing I can offer.
And we're probably running short on time, but maybe one wrap-up question. In the interest of some spirited debate potentially, the audience is interested to know panelists' views about the proposal that Secretary Baker presented during his remarks. And I'll just kind of open this up to anyone who might have comments or thoughts on the plan that he's put forth.
Maybe I'll just a short comment. Have long been a supporter of the carbon tax as a way to drive efficiency and let industry decide what emissions are the most efficient rather than policy. And so the rebate or the dividend is the first time I've ever heard of a way of that benefiting all the American public. So I vote yes.
There's a major benefit of a tax over the idea of some sort of carbon market or trading scheme is the simplicity of it. They're both ideas that have been kind of promoted and discussed. But I think the reason why industry tends to prefer a tax over the idea of a trading scheme is that it's simpler, it's more predictable, and I think from the point of view of public policy, there's a greater probability that a simpler scheme will end up providing the types of benefits that you would want to accomplish, as opposed to creating a system where a bunch of smart bankers are going to figure out how to manage it and game it. So. Again, the big wrinkle here is that you can, no offense there to my...
No offense, at least they're smart. Yeah. They could be dumb bankers.
Yeah, exactly, right, smart pigs. The one wrinkle, obviously, is that this, this would be a tax that's then immediately rebated back to the public, and so the idea is that that's an idea that would be acceptable to both the Republicans and the Democrats. The devil's in the details in terms of... I'm very supportive of things that you can actually do, which are infinitely better than things that you can't do. If this is something that could be presented in a way that is palatable to both sides and actually moves the needle, I mean, I would see it as something that might drive, the behavior of folks out there trying to deploy capital. One of the complications is, well, and it's all optics. It's like, how do you sell the idea? From the Republican side, there will be the perception that this is another kind of redistribution of wealth, that you're taking, money from companies who are earning money, and you're just splitting it up, and how do you divide it amongst the population, and how do you do that in a way that's amenable to, the various folks who will throw rocks at any plan that you put forward. But certainly, again, the details will be important, but I hopefully this will be a debate that goes forward and it actually gets discussed.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists, and we really appreciate your time.